For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate Swanson. I'm the Interpretation and Public Engagement Educator at the Rockwell Museum. And if I do say so myself, I've gotten really good at speaking to my computer alone in my home. So that's something that I accomplished in the year 2020. This year, the Rockwell Museum is exploring the myriad ways in which artists respond to, engage with, or interrupt the natural, built, and social environment. We might be joining from all over tonight since we're virtual, but I want to recognize that an important element of the Rockwell Museum's environment is that we're located on the ancestral land of the Seneca, one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Tonight, we'll see images of many landscapes set against that backdrop in our presentation of Women Painting Landscape, Eliza Greatorex, Julia Beers, and Their Circle with Professor Katherine Manthorne of the graduate program of the City University of New York. We present this lecture this evening in honor of David Gray, who was a collector and a dear friend to American art institutions. And Katherine will say a few more words about him when we begin. Katherine Manthorne is our speaker tonight, and she is a specialist in modern art of the Americas, earned her PhD from Columbia University. Prior to joining the faculty at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, she was director of the Research Center at Smithsonian's American Art Museum. Her fellowships include the Tyson Scholarship at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, a Terra Foundation professor at Free University in Berlin, and senior Fulbright Research Fellow at the University of Venice. Her scholarship has long been focused on landscape and hemispheric dimensions of American art, beginning with Tropical Renaissance. And these topics have been explored in books such as North American Artists Exploring Latin America, 1839 to 1879. That one was published in 1989. And continuing in California Mexicana, Missions to Murals, 1820 to 1930, published in 2017. Katherine also has a new book out in 2020 about our very topic tonight, and we'll share a little bit more about that at the end. And that's titled Restless Enterprise, The Art and Life of Eliza Greatorex. We're always sorry to not be in person, but especially so today because the Rockwell actually recently acquired phenomenal artworks by the artists Beers and Greatorex. And we've learned, well, I mean, surely people who acquire the paintings knew this already, but I've learned that women landscape painters are really difficult to come by in public collections. So this is a really exciting thing for the Rockwell. And so we really hope that you'll visit the museum soon and see these new works on display. We are open to the public, even though we are trying to stay home as much as possible. Hence, you know, everyone joining in our slippers tonight.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And I want to especially thank the staff at the Rockwell Museum. I've been dealing a lot with Kate. She's the person I've had most contact with, so I really want to thank her for all her help. And I'm really so excited that the museum has purchased some of these paintings by women artists. So on the screen now, my title, you can see Women Painting Landscape. And on the upper left is the painting by Eliza Granger X, now in the Rockwell. And the lower right corner is the Julia Hart Beers. So we'll be doing a kind of deep dive into these pictures, but I just wanted to sort of highlight them at the beginning, just so you have a little bit of an idea of where we're headed. So as Kate mentioned, this lecture is dedicated to the late David Gray and his wife, Laura. They were extraordinary collectors, and Laura still is an extraordinary collector of American art and friends of American art just generally. And it was actually David who put me in touch with the staff of the Rockwell Museum to give this lecture. And here you can see David and Laura standing in front of their heart. This is a painting by Julia Hart Beers' brother. We'll be talking about this, and I'm standing there gesturing towards it. I had done an exhibition. It was just about a year ago now that it opened at the Frost Museum at the Florida International University in Miami. And David and Laura very generously lent a huge portion of their collection. I kept going back to them and saying, well, can you lend this one more picture? And could we possibly have this picture? And they basically said yes to everything. And as you know, if you have, whatever cherished possessions you have, it's very hard to live without them for a long period of time. And but they were just so great about it. And it was really such a gratifying experience, because in Miami, there aren't really a lot of galleries that really have 19th century American landscape painting. So it was wonderful for the students at the university, the faculty, and others to really become acquainted with this wonderful collection. So we're really grateful to them, and we really want to honor him. I just wish he could be here to hear this lecture. So I wanted to start out by just giving you a little bit of an overview of a few of the early women who painted landscape. As Kate was saying, we don't always think of this as being an activity of the women of the period, but the more you look, the more you find, and research is really revealing some incredible examples. So here you can see on the screen, this is a work by Louisa Davis Minot. And you can see her dates here. She was born in the late 18th century. And she actually wrote an essay in 1815 on Niagara. She traveled up there from her home in New England. She starts to really describe her feelings when she sees the Niagara Falls. And she's talking about, fear, anxiety, just the wonderful kinds of range of emotions that she experiences when she sees this mighty waterfall. And literally, she's talking in the language of the sublime. She's recognizing these ideas of that nature can make you feel very small and really terrify you. And if you've ever gone to the Niagara Falls, even now, you can actually have those feelings, although not as much as probably she did in 1815 when she was there. So this was also the period of the just after the War of 1812, there was a lot of devastation there. So, think about this idea of a woman in 1815 traveling up to this region and then creating this painting, which is quite, a good size, 30 by 40 inches. And here in the lower right, I'm showing you a detail of that, just to give you a sense of how she creates the foam of the water and these figures. And this is a typical strategy in landscape art to actually show the figures responding to nature. And here's another work that she did of the same place around the same time, and you can see the same dimensions. So she intended this to be a pair, or pendants as we call them. And unfortunately, these are basically the only two works we know by this artist. There must be others, because clearly she's very skilled and she must have had artistic training and done other works, but these are the only two we know. So just if you stop and think about the chronology for a second, when you think of the Hudson River School and the beginnings of American landscape art, usually the date that's cited is 1825. That was the time when Thomas Cole, very famously did this image of Fort Putnam and exhibited it in New York. So here's this woman traveling to Niagara 1815, depicting these falls in a rather masterful way in 1818. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of research we still need to do to recover some of these women. This is another work of Josephine Walters. She had studied with Asher B. Durand. And if you know that name, he was considered, the dean of the Hudson River School, so-called. And we know that when John Durand wrote the book about his father, he actually says that Josephine Walters was his favorite female student. So that tells us, first of all, that he thought she was quite good, of course, but second of all, that there must have been other female students as well. So this just, again, gives us a little bit of an idea of the cast of characters. So here I like to show these images. These are by Winslow Homer in the 1860s. On the left, you can see this is a painting that he did of in the White Mountains. And there you have a sequence of 3 artists in a row painting basically the same motif. You can see they have their equipment. I just show in the lower left They brought a heavy bag of material. They have their umbrellas, their easel, their stool. This is all the kind of material that you'd have to lug up to the top of the mountain, carry to the top of the mountain in order to set up your equipment and paint these images. And on the right, it just suggests this idea of the gender roles, right? Here you see the man looking, painting at his easel. This was an illustration that Homer did for Appleton's magazine in 1869. And the woman is looking on, encouraging him, admiring his work. So the idea doesn't really occur to this couple that the woman might sit down and actually do a painting too, but in a way, that's kind of where we're heading, right? So first I wanted to talk about Julie Hart Beers. Her family came from Scotland to the United States. She was the youngest of, I think, 10 siblings. So most of them were born in Scotland. She was born here in the United States in the Berkshires. So she marries this man named Beers. They had 2 children. He passed away, and without leaving her much in the way of support. So she has to support her daughters with art sales, and also, as artists still do to this day, teaching. So this includes, she takes people, especially women, on summer sketch tours. And her 2 brothers were also well-known landscapists, William Hart and James McDougall Hart. And then just to mention, in 1876, she marries this man named Kempson. So sometimes you'll see the name Kempson, but she in fact continued to sign her name as Julie Hart Beers. So this is the work in the Rockwell Museum. And so I just wanted to take a minute to look at this, to study it. Hopefully you'll get a chance to see it in person soon. You can see from the dimensions that it's a relatively small work. And this is the kind of thing where we don't know exactly where she was. That's not really the point of this work. It's not meant to be some kind of specific site, but it's a small corner of nature, an anonymous corner where you can just enjoy the plants and the quiet water and this kind of wonderful atmospheric day. And if you look in the foreground, you can see, she's very adept at painting the plants and the grass and in differentiating them. And of course, the birch tree sort of crowns the whole thing against the green. So she's, in 1873, she's quite adept at these kind of images. And this is really a wonderful example of her work. This is the work by her brother, William Hart. This is the one I was showing you at the beginning with the gray standing in front of it. This is called Along the Winding Way. You can see this is a large scale picture, 39 by 54. And her other brother, James McDougall, the Old Homestead, which is in the High Museum. So she's growing up in a family, she's the youngest, she's the female of the family, and her brothers are already accomplished painters. So we can only imagine, excuse me, the kind of, in a way, competition in the family. She clearly has artistic talent, and the fact that her brothers are already succeeding as painters in this period. So I just wanted to read you. This was a passage from an article by a woman journalist. Her name is Lucy Lee Holbrook. So she explains the origins of Julia Hart Beers' career. She says, when her husband died 12 years ago, her brothers advised her to turn to painting as an occupation. Then it was an uncommon thing for a woman to do, to go out sketching in the country. And when she asked permission to go with her brothers, they advised against it, saying she could not stand up the exposure and they could not adapt their movements to her weakness. So it's odd that they told her to be an artist, but then they don't really want to go sketching with her. But anyway, she took up the challenge, and she writes, where they forded streams, I forded them, and I tramped on after them many a weary mile through the mud and wet, when it seemed to me I could go no further. So these experiences basically prove her mettle in the field. She could keep up with her brothers. She could paint landscapes too, but yet, as you just saw from their work versus hers, she just differentiates herself. She's not just, following the family business. She's actually, putting her own stamp on these things. So here I just wanted to show you, this is the Hudson River at Croton Point from 1869. And as you'll see, many of the landscapes the common motif is to have, the figure on a path that sort of gives you the idea of scale and suggests the relationship between nature and the humans. But here, if you look more closely, this is not the best detail, but you can perhaps make out that the figure here has a skirt, wearing a skirt. It's a female. So she's actually showing the detail of the mother and child on the path, which is rather unusual. More normally it's a man or a man and a woman, but not usually a woman and a child. So already she's beginning to sort of rethink this idea of the woman sort of appropriating the landscape and inserting the presence into these different images. And you can see this is quite wonderful. I mean, the foreground, we're here on this spit of land, which provides one of the best views of the Hudson. And then as you look out towards the landscape, you can see the path of the Hudson going up towards Albany, and this wonderful combination of the near detail and the more sweeping distance. And this is another, I think, another fascinating image that again suggests this idea. She's really very conscious about herself as a woman painter. This, you can see the scene is the Hudson as seen from a Henry Villard's house in Tarrytown. But you can see here, this is a shaped canvas. This is she's painted it as a round canvas. And again, we make a big deal out of shaped canvases in the 20th century. Many of the modernists did this, but here she's doing it in 1881. So you start to think, okay, what's this about? What's she doing? And I can't help thinking that it has partly to do with this idea that many women at the time were hired as china painters. It was kind of a, like an artisanal kind of vocation. And they were considered to be good people to do this because they could, as the descriptions would go, they were very good at detail. They could, copy patterns, things like that. So they're copying onto china well-known landscapes. But here you can see now she's kind of playing on that. She's making a more creative landscape, but the canvas is now in the shape of perhaps of a plate. But certainly, in any case, another wonderful example of her work. And then as she continues in her career, she tries different kinds of formats. She does the kind of living still life. And here you can see in the lower corner of the picture, she's inscribed it. She went to New Orleans. This is 1888. But again, rather than being just a still life of fruit in a bowl or something, she's actually showing the fruit growing on the branches. So it's this very kind of vital sense of the vitality of nature that she's conveying here. And then I started thinking, the more you start looking at some of her pictures, the more you start to notice there are a fair number of birch trees in her work. And, of course, this could be partly, they're just beautiful trees. They provide a visual contrast to all the green around them. But then I started thinking about that idea that here they are from Scotland. They had a sort of identity from that part of the world. And the birch tree is actually one of the most sacred in the Celtic mythology, symbolizing new life and renewal. So this might seem like a bit of a foreign way of thinking to us in the 21st century. In the 19th century, there was very much this idea of the language of nature. They had many books on the language of flowers. Different flowers had different symbolism. Different trees had different symbolism. So she may actually be thinking in those terms in some of her pictures. And here's just one more with a birch tree. You can see this is 1908. So she continues to paint until near the end of her life. She dies in 1913. And this was recently acquired by the Davis Museum of Wells College, so Women's College. But here again, you can see the birch trees. But then as you look more closely, I included that arrow where there are actually initials on the tree. So again, this could be something you just happened upon. This happens, of course, all the time. But then could this also be something about her attitude towards the environment? That man has somehow interceded in this, or I shouldn't say man, I said some humankind has interceded here, and that perhaps this tree now doesn't look as robust. It's sort of, peeling and dying as a result of the fact that in some weird sense, it's been violated. So again, I think the women, as well as the male landscape painters, were thinking about this idea of nature in a very organic sense. And they thought of themselves in a way as the protectors and the interpreters of nature. So these environmental issues were very, even though they might not have called it exactly that, were very much in their thinking. So I wanted to move on now to Eliza Granger X. She became a good friend of Julia Hart Beers. She was born in Ireland and came to the United States from Ireland at the age of 29 during the Irish potato famine. So she arrives in 1848. She must have had training there. This is the subject of my book. I searched for years about to find more details about her life, but I never found much about that early art training. But she comes to New York in 1848. Within a year, she marries Henry Gradey X, who was a musician and a composer. So here you can see 20 years later, which is kind of amazing, I think, she is nominated to the National Academy of Design. And that was at the time the most prestigious art organization in the United States. And at the time, she was the only elected female member. A few years later, a few other women were elected. We know also that Lily Martin Spencer was an honorary member, but she wasn't actually elected and made a full member. So when the rule was that when you were elected to the academy, you had to provide a portrait or a self-portrait. So here you can see she's hired or engaged in some way this artist Ferdinand Boyle to paint her portrait. And you can see she's dressed herself all, all in black, and she's holding not a paintbrush, but a quill pen. She has her portfolio of drawings, and of course she's wearing black. She's very serious. And you can see that she has gray hair. She's already 50 years old. So I think we have to keep in mind too, when we talk about women, that many, medical people, psychologists, cultural historians have talked about the idea that women's life trajectories are different from men, and that often, especially in the creative fields, that women really tend to peak a little bit later, and oftentimes once their spouse dies, which is partly the case here, because Henry died in 1858, 10 years after marriage. He left her with 4 children and no real financial stability. So she begins to support her family with her art. And these are just pictures of 2 of her daughters. They're much later in 1890, but they were both became artists, and neither one of them ever married. So Kathleen and Eleanor Granger X, the 2 daughters, and their mother were basically a kind of mini corporation. They travel together, they work together, and they often live together. So it's a kind of gynocentric community. So here, shortly after Eliza gets to New York, and New York City begins to have buildings dedicated to artist studios. And here on the left, you're looking at one of the most famous ones. This is the 10th Street Studio building, which was at, as you can see, 51 West 10th Street. And this is a photograph that Bernice Abbott, the well-known photographer, took in the 1830s. So the building, the 1930s. So the building was built and opened in late in 1858 and survives all the way into the 1960s. So over 100 years, and then it was lost. But in any case, some of the best known artists of the day, Frederick Church, Winslow Homer, they all had their studios here. And on the right, I'm just showing you, this became a function of the New York art world in this period. They would have what they call the artist receptions. So you can see each of these vignettes is a different artist studio. They would announce in the newspaper, okay, tonight is the artist reception at the 10th Street building. All the public is invited. So people would circulate around to the different studios. The artists would show them their work and talk to them. So this was kind of a wonderful way of intersecting with the public in the days before there were very many galleries. So unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the building where Gradey X and Beers lived. They lived in the Dodworth building, which is at 5th Avenue and 26th Street. But similar things went on there. So we know, for example, I found a review saying we visited the studio of Mrs. Granger X. It was beautifully decorated. She had this painting and that painting on view. So we know that this was the way that the women as well as the men had access to the public and could show their work and, start to really promote sales. So this is the work that Grader X did pretty early in her career. I just show it to you as a way of sort of a benchmark of her style. This is Tullylarkin Ireland, which was the homestead of her mother's people. So you can see as you look at it, this will become a mark of her composition. She shows a building sheltered by trees on the left, open to the sky on the right. But as you look at the paint handling, it's a little bit broad. It's not very, you don't get much detail in the trees. You don't get much nuance of the color of the greens. The sky is quite wonderful. So this is from the 1850s. She's just beginning to exhibit in New York. And then she gets the idea, okay, I can see as well as anyone that I need a little more training. So she decides to go to France. And she goes in 1861, she leaves just before the Civil War breaks out. So she's away for over a year. She left her children in the care of her sister, who lived in Cornwall and Hudson. So she's taking care of all her own children, plus Eliza's children. So, again, I mention this because in a way she's a very these women are face the same challenges as women do today. They were quote unquote single mothers. They had to find a way to juggle career and children. For a landscape painter, what did you do with your children? I mean, a lot of times they ended up bringing their children with them and having them sort of play outside while they sat there and tried to paint a picture. So these women were, really inventing their way of working as they went along, and they seemed very determined to actually become artists. So this is Wash Day at Chevreuse. This is a scene in France, and I just want to show you a detail in a minute. This is her teacher, Emile Charles Lambinet. So she had gone to, when she goes to France, of course, she spends some time in Paris, but she also goes out to Barbizon, which was in a small village in the Fontainebleau forest, and works with some of the Barbizon painters. So she's sort of making her technique more sophisticated and sort of updating it. And here you can see this is just a detail of that image I was showing you before. You can see the women doing the wash here. And then, I mean, can you imagine doing your laundry this way? This is a big boiling cauldron of water that each of them has, and they're washing the clothes in these pots. So we don't have much commentary from her when she went to France, but a few years later, she goes to Germany, and she does talk about the lives of the women there. Later, when she goes to Colorado too, she talks about the women in the West and just what their lives are like. So again, it's part feminist, part ecological concerns. These things are all sort of bubbling up in their work and in their thinking. So, and just to mention too, that she was a regular exhibitor at the Paris Salon. She always listed herself as a student of Lambinet. I guess she thought that was a way of honoring him, but also probably a way of showing that she had French training. And here you can see this view of the salon, what we call the salon hanging. There would be row upon row towards the very high ceiling of these pictures. So to get into the salon, you had to submit your work. It wasn't just a matter that everyone would be included. Judges decided if you would be included or not. And then the next step would be, okay, where are they going to hang my picture? So if pictures were so-called on the line, as you can see here, then people could easily see them. But others would be, as they called, skied, further and further up towards the ceiling. You had no hope of anyone seeing it. So, they're trying to get their work noticed. They're very much conducting themselves in a very professional way. So this leads us to the Rockwell Museum's picture. This would have been done after she went to Paris, after she went to Barbizon. And you can see now that from that earlier Irish picture I showed you to this one, much more adept at handling the paint, composing the picture. And of course, you can see this very kind of bucolic scene with the cows lying there in the foreground. And the reference to being near Cragsmoor, Cragsmoor was an artist colony that she later got involved with, but at this point it's still a bit early. She's exploring the area, and you can see the Shawangunk Mountains off in the distance. So she's developing a good sense of the American terrain and creating these wonderful landscapes. And this is just one more. This is Moodna Creek that she did in July 1866. She actually indicated on the back a day and year and a month. And I'm showing you on the right the Outdoors at Idlewild by N.P. Willis. Willis was a well-known kind of writer and editor, and he built this wonderful house, Idlewild, right around this vicinity where Gradey X is painting. So I'm surmising that Willis must have welcomed her to be on his property to explore. This was also near Cornwall and Hudson, where her sister lived. So all the, she's sort of integrating herself into the New York scene. Willis was a very well-connected writer and editor. And, he's sort of talking about his house. He had his house built in such a way that each window of the house would allow you to see these wonderful vistas onto the landscape. So this is sort of prime area of, the Hudson River and the American Landscape School that she brings herself to paint and visit. So since the Rockwell theme is actually this year the environment, last year it was women, so we're sort of bridging the two, I wanted to talk a little bit about women as stewards of the landscape and to focus on a woman named Susan Fenimore Cooper. So that name is probably familiar. Her father was James Fenimore Cooper, and often until very recently, she was always mentioned as being his secretary and helper. But the more, again, we start to explore these things, we discover that she actually wrote this book called Rural Hours in 1850, which went through numerous editions. Every year another edition would come out. And she was among the first American writers to warn about the dangers of overusing natural resources. So again, if you think about the chronology of the people we normally celebrate, like Thoreau for his writing, she's actually writing before him. And this is the cover of her book in the middle. You can see it's called, her first edition was 1850. This is the 1854 edition. I didn't have the first edition cover, but you can see she doesn't identify her name. She says, by a lady. And you can see there's her image in the upper right, and that she was actually an artist, a writer, and a naturalist. So she actually does these illustrations for her own book. So this is, again, someone who is putting out a lot of ideas about conserving nature, women's roles in all of this, and we don't always recognize these people, but I'm sure that people like Beers and Gradey X knew of her work. It's not just published as a book, but it was also put serialized in the journals, in the periodicals and things like that. So she was hardly an unknown person at the time, even though we've kind of lost track of her since. And here I just wanted to show you her father, James Fenimore Cooper, was very friendly with Samuel F.B. Morse. So that name might be familiar because of the telegraph or the Morse code. But as many of you know, Morse started out as a painter. So he and James Fenimore Cooper were extremely good friends. They were both in France at the same time, in Paris at the same time, when Morse painted this picture. And here I'm just showing you, he actually includes Susan Fenimore Cooper sitting right here. Her parents are behind her. And she's doing a copy of one of these paintings in the Louvre. So this was a major way that people learned how to become painters. They would copy the old masters. And here you can see that Morse, basically, this very large painting, I put the dimensions at the top, has recreated all these different masterpieces in the Louvre. So this just tells us that first, that Susan Fenimore Cooper is learning how to paint, has a good background, is very cultured. She's in France, sorry, and generally has a very sophisticated outlook. So to come back to Gradey X then, and this idea of the environment, this is a work that she painted on the Bloomingdale Road, which many of you know was Broadway. So in the 1860s, after the Civil War, the area in the northern part of Manhattan was is still rural. There were farms. You can see these little farmhouses and the dirt road. But people like Boss Tweed and others were hell-bent on paving this road, making Broadway a clear path all the way from one end of Manhattan to the other. So these buildings start to be threatened. They're going to cut them down in the name of progress, demolish them in the name of progress. So Gradey X is very distraught by this, by the destruction of the built environment as well as the natural environment. And she starts doing these pictures that record these soon to be lost houses. So this is again, and she does it in paint, but then she also, because of the swiftness of this process that more and more buildings are being destroyed, she starts using pen and ink that gives her more mobility. And she's taking her paper, pen, and ink, and she's going to these different sites as she hears that they are being destroyed. So this is, again, just think of this, the Upper West Side in the 1860s with, grass, tree-covered lanes and farmhouses. This is what she's encountering and recording and, expressing her outrage at the loss of these things. Fidelia Bridges is another really interesting woman of the time. And I think she also was hooked into Susan Fenimore Cooper's ideas, because Cooper talks a lot about the cycles of nature and, looking at a same place month after month to see the changes. And you can see that here, Fidelia Bridges does do a series of 12 months. I'm just showing you February and April. But then she also was hired by this man named Louis Prang. And I don't know if that name is familiar, but Prang formed this company, chromolithography. That is, he's making prints, colored prints that he sells, widely in multiples. So rather than, like Fidelia Bridges would make one watercolor that one person would buy, but here she's making this series, and Prang is distributing it, in could be 100 copies. So people are, middle-class people can acquire this type of art. And again, learning to see another side of nature. Beers too, this is the farm on the Hudson. And again, I think, sometimes we look at these cows and we think, oh, well, it's just a little, detail to suggest the idea of the countryside. But I think the more you look at these pictures, the more you realize that this seems to be another reference of non-invasive or intrusive agriculture that's suggesting the harmony of mankind or humankind and nature. And here you can see too the different stone walls that have been erected, demarcating the different areas of the land, and possibly the wheat field there in the golden colors. So she's also celebrating this idea of not necessarily just leaving nature totally untouched, but being respectful and leaving it in and living in harmony with it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the whole idea of the practicality of this. What's a woman to wear when she's fording streams, climbing mountains, or painting cows? So we have to think about practicality, fashion, and convention. So here on the left, you can see, this is the female dress code circa 1870, right? You have long skirts, hooped, multiple petticoats underneath, tight bodice, little fancy bonnets, and tiny little parasols. So is this the kind of thing that a proper Victorian woman, is expected to wear? But can you really wear that when you're going out to paint the landscape? So this is a woman, a picture of Fidelia Bridges on the right, dressed for the field. So you can see she's actually has a shortened dress, pants underneath, much more sturdy boots. And here she has her her portable easel and her large umbrella that she'll need out in the field versus these tiny little parasols. So, and here I love this. I found this recently is from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from 1935. They're looking back on Fidelia Bridges, and you can see they've done a caricature of her here. And here's this mountain she's climbing. The article said that Fidelia Bridges with Mrs. Loynes climbed Whiteface Mountain from the Lake Placid side after going through the Indian Pass the day before, quote, further than any other woman had gone at the same time. So these women are out in the landscape just like the men. They're not just, sitting in some field or in their garden. They're climbing some of the toughest mountains. So I think that's really exciting to discover some of these things. Well, here you can see, I just wanted to mention a predecessor for some of these women in America. This is Rosa Bonor. She was a French painter. And this on the right is her sort of first huge success. A picture of these are 12 oxen, some special type of oxen. I don't know, I forget the name of them. Maybe somebody here knows about oxen. But in any case, you can see they're a pretty large painting, 36 by 52. So how is Rosa Bonor going to go out into the fields or into the barns and paint these creatures, dressed up the way we saw those women were supposed to be dressed up? So she concocts her own outfit, which you can see on the left, a dress over these pants. But if you can imagine, in France in this period, she actually had to go to the police station and get a permit, which had to be renewed every month in order to wear her pants. So these are the kinds of challenges that the women are facing, but they managed to overcome these challenges. And here I wanted to show you when Kate Swanson and I were talking, she mentioned that they also just acquired this painting, The Landscape with Cows, by another woman artist who's not so well known yet, Susan Waters. And we couldn't help laughing and thinking that she probably, was aware of the example of Rosa Bonor. Here you can see she's clearly very into the cattle, but also because Rosa Bonor was very well known in the United States, some of her paintings came over here, and there were frequent articles in the press about her. So, she was well known. And this is just one more example, Susie Barf style. That's one of her landscapes on the left, and on the right, a picture of her in her studio. And we know that she too, she was an intrepid mountain climber. She had to her record, she climbed over 100 different peaks and was a member of these different mountain climbing clubs. So again, what does she wear? How does she get dressed up? She wore something, she describes it, I so far haven't found a picture of her in it, but she describes that she had a similar outfit to Fidelia Bridges with the pants and the skirt, but what she would do is around her waist, she would attach these hooks all around her waist so that when she wanted to climb the mountain, she would take the bottom of her skirt and hook them onto these hooks, latch them onto the hooks around her waist so that she could climb freely up the mountain. So, again, ingenuity. Gradey X too, when she was, even when she was in the city, running around to different sites, she had to be portable. She had to be able to move quickly. So what she would do is she would use this inkhorn and penner. And here on the left, you can see the intact instrument, which would fit all together. And then you could put it into your pocket or into a field bag. And then on the right, I'm just showing you, you would unscrew all the different parts, and then you would have the powdered ink, the inkwell, and the quill pen, and then you would easily be able to set to work. So again, this gave them mobility and the possibility of, traveling light, because those easels and all those the paints and all that, that was, all in wooden crates, so that was very heavy. And so she and her daughters in 1873 go to Colorado. And they were in the area of Colorado Springs and some of the other areas, Pikes Peak, some of the things around there. And here you can see on the right, this is one of the illustrations from her book. And I'm just showing you with that orange arrow, 3 small figures in the landscape, because the artist Eliza Granger X and her 2 daughters climbed this mountain. And she describes in the book what they had to do. She just says, they didn't devise one of these special ensembles. They just took a skirt, stuffed it in their belt. She had her umbrella, that was also stuck in her belt. And then they were actually wearing veils because, proper Victorian women were supposed to have, beautiful white skin. They weren't supposed to be suntanned. So she talks about, having the veil getting in their way and all these problems, but yet they, managed to climb to the summit of some of these places and produce this wonderful book about her experiences. So to conclude then, we have to ask ourselves, what is it we want to have happen? We can research individual women. We can find more and more paintings. Hopefully they have out there somewhere. We can reconstruct more biographies. But in the end, I don't think the goal is really just to look at the women separately. I think we have to really integrate and insert them into the story of American landscape art. So I like to imagine that this image that we started with over here, Winslow Homer, the man and the woman, imagine Fidelia Bridges showing up, or any of these women showing up with their equipment and just setting up right next to the span and having everyone, you know, be happy that that's what's happened. So I hope that we can continue to research these women, but then also really integrate them into the bigger story, because until we have the full picture of people of color, women, everyone, we don't really fully understand American art even yet. So you can follow the further adventures in my new book that Kate mentioned. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
I have a couple of questions coming in. The first one that I have is about the question about painting plein air, which is something we talk about a lot with Hudson River School, or their landscape painters. When we look at these really large canvases, you know, were those all done outside, or did they do that in the studio?
I think, you know, and probably in most cases, it was they did smaller works in the field. This was the same practice with the male artists as well. You know, like someone like Frederick Church, he travels to South America, or he travels to see the icebergs, and he comes home with a rich portfolio of not just oil. They might have done oil sketches in the field, that is, you know, small pictures with using oil paint and color, but then they would also probably have had just notebooks where they made like pencil drawings or pen and ink drawings, as Eliza did, and, you know, maybe some color notations and things like that that they would make to remind themselves, because the general practice was from maybe April or May until October, they would be, you know, the American landscape artists would usually be out in the field. And then in the winter months, they would go to their studios and, you know, spread out all their drawings and whatever, and start to produce paintings in the studio. Because, well, it's funny, because if you start to actually look at some of the oil sketches and things like that, you can actually see you know, like insect marks, you know, like, because and the artist letters, they never talk about like great motifs or artwork they're doing. They, you know, like everyone else, they're complaining about the mosquitoes or the heat. So, you know, to have a really large painting out of doors would to be trying to paint that would be kind of challenging for most people. Yeah.
There would be bugs smushed into it. That is something I've never thought about. That's very funny. Thanks. Another great question is, you know, that it's not easy to come by research about women artists, obviously. So what is your process for uncovering, you know, facts about the life of somebody like Eliza Granger X?
Well,
How do you?
It did take quite a long time, so it's not like if you want immediate gratification, this might not be the thing for you to do. But you know, there are multiple avenues that are open. One of them is really, you know, there are so many good indices now for the 19th century periodicals and newspapers. So one of the things is I, you know, just went through and I had a whole giant notebook of just year by year, the different notices that I found in the newspapers. Some people have been lucky, and some of the quote unquote their artists kept diaries or wrote, you know, more letters. But Gradey X was not really like that. She said, "I hate writing letters." And she just seemed always very busy and you know, didn't really record what she was doing. But the newspapers were a big help. And then, of course, now we all have Ancestry and the genealogy records. So I was able to, you know, find some things that way. And, you know, and then once you start to get, the name gets out a little bit, then dealers and other people will start to recognize the paintings more. Or even if you publish even a short article that says, like, sometimes if they would sign their name like just EG, and people might not know who the heck is EG, you know. So if you start to try to get their name out there, even in the most basic way, then people start recognizing that they do have something. So, it's a slow process. Also, in her case, she was, had an international career. So, some things were found in like Ireland, some things were found in France, Germany. So, again, it's a matter of trying to get the word out in different ways to, giving papers at conferences or even just writing to people and asking them.
Mhm. Great. Sounds fun.
Yeah, so it's detective work. I mean, part of it really is detective work.
Right. No, it's great. A related question is a good one. How is it that, it is difficult to uncover a lot of that? How is it that these women were forgotten in the first place in the story of American landscape painting?
Well, I mean, it is frustrating. I mean, you have to keep in mind that a lot of the male artists were lost too, were forgotten for a long time too. I mean, Frederick Church was probably in the 1850s, he was the most famous artist in America. I mean, he was getting $10,000 for one painting, and his paintings were going on tour 10 different cities. By 1870, he was, home at his home in the Hudson River. And wasn't making much art. By the time he died, people saw the notice in the paper and they said, "Oh, we thought he died a long time ago." So it's a lot of the American landscape art was for a while forgotten because I think the whole story of modernism and things going from like say impressionism to post-impressionism to cubism, that kind of left out a lot of these realist artists in not just women but men and in Europe too. And so it's only over time that there, this kind of historical revival, if you will, or revisionism has started to recognize these gaps. And I mean, so that's one problem. The other problem is too that some of them didn't paint as, some of the women didn't paint as didn't have as public a career as the men. So they weren't exhibiting as much or so there isn't as good a record of them. And then, I think it's partly just a matter of sometimes the family. I've contacted families that have had different works by artists, and they said, well, we're going to write a book about her, so we can't share that. And then, they never, of course, some of them never do. So, then the sort of work sits with the family and it doesn't, and it doesn't help the artist's career either. So, there are a lot of different factors, but I think that, when you look at some of these paintings, you have to say they were as good as the men. So that's not really, it's not really the issue of just quality.
Thank you. That's a great answer. A lot of things to think about. I have a couple of questions that are more directed just to you and your work. I have a question of whether you have any plans to develop this research into an exhibition.
That would be fun to do. I mean, it all happened with COVID, of course. I felt so lucky that they got the book out because I knew, I knew some authors whose books were either postponed or actually canceled because the publication process started, just before the COVID hit. So the book was actually supposed to be published in China. Nobody, wanted to deal with China at that point in the early in COVID. So they actually switched to Vietnam. And so, it was so great just to get the book out. But I mean, it would be wonderful to have an exhibition. So I hope that as things start to calm down and people want to, get out and about again, that yes, it would be wonderful.
Well, you might have an interested, that question's from a curator at an American Art Museum. So you might have an interested party.
Oh.
And a couple of questions just about your book. Does the book include color reproductions of the paintings? Probably some.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And actually, I mean, what I tried to do in the book, it's not really a conventional monograph. I tried to really develop all her different, Gradey X's different networks. So there is a whole section about beers. There is a whole section about, bridges. There is, some of the critics, the female critics, the female collectors. I tried to really sort of, because it was really a kind of, an alternative network of artists and cultural leaders, these women. And I didn't mention in this talk, but I have talked elsewhere, that some of these people were also very involved with the women's movement. So Gradey X, for example, was friends with Susan B. Anthony. She organized the artists, women artists for the Women's Pavilion at the Centennial. So, their activities were really multifaceted, and, they weren't just like bohemian painters just painting. You know, they were mothers, they were women's rights people, they were, you know.
Yeah, that's appreciated in the like canon of art history, to think of them as full people and not just, you know, artists. Yeah. We have just one, this will probably be our last question. So we're just getting to the end, but it's kind of related to what you started saying about, you know, thinking about them as full people and including critics and writers as well. But the question is, did the artists face prejudice when it came to marketing their work, and how did they overcome this?
Well, that's a good question. I think, you know, some of the male artists and, you know, and Rosa Bonor also followed this, this kind of model. You know, she sent her large painting, I don't know if some of you know it, it's called The Horse Fair in the Metropolitan Museum. So that was a very large scale picture that was sent over from France to the United States and shown, as they called it, the big picture exhibition. It was just shown by itself, and it became, you know, very, you know, much a celebrity picture. And so some of the men, like Church and others, Bierstadt would do that too. The women really took alternative pathways. For example, Gradey X, you know, did the drawings. She actually put her work into books, illustrated, you know, she published them as portfolios and as books, and as kind of ensembles, so that when she showed her work at the Centennial, she had almost like a whole niche or a whole section where she laid out all her works together, like paintings, drawings, pen and ink, books. So to see them as more like a Gesamtkunstwerk, you know, like it was all part of one totality, as opposed to, so I think of her as kind of almost a conceptual artist, because it's not like it depends on the single image that, you know, it hangs on the wall. For her, it was really much a part of a grand scheme and a whole project. And I think Beers too, you know, or Fidelia Bridges, you know, they're reaching a wider public. Bridges works with Louis Prang, you know, when she was first exhibited, and there was actually a review of some of her work, and they said, you know, she's so good, we bet anything that Louis Prang will go after her, but we hope he doesn't, because, you know, that will be the end of her talent. And so, you know, so she starts, you know, she's making Christmas cards, she's making these other kinds of images, but I think we shouldn't think of that as necessarily a bad thing, because she's reaching, you know, like far more people. You know, middle-class people can have these pictures hanging on their walls. And, you know, people like Thomas Moran, they forget that Thomas Moran made calendars, you know? So sometimes we tend to think that the women were doing something, you know, that they might be called domestic arts or decorative art, but really at the time, that was part of the whole ethos of being an artist. You didn't restrict yourself to just one medium.
Right. I always think about that when we talk about, yeah, people who are big names, you know, whether it's in the past or today with teaching or doing, you know, right, making prints and everything, like, oh, you know, well, they're not a full-time, they're not making their career just as being an artist. It's like, well, who is? Is anyone really succeeding only by selling their artwork? Not very many people do that. So it doesn't really, you know, that's not a judgment call by any means.
And I mean, in the case of Greatorex, she kind of reinvents herself 3 times over, because she starts out as doing more oil painting, then she does the pen and ink drawings that she puts together into a book. And then I didn't even get to it, but she goes on to do plein air etchings. And actually this image that I have as my backdrop, that's her most famous plein air etching that she does in the 1880s. So, and she's touted as a, you know, as a leader of the etching revival. So, you know, you know, some of the men, in fact, just, you know, they were like, I call them Johnny One Notes, you know, they did one thing and they just kept doing it. They did it well and they sold, and that was fine, but she keeps exploring. And I think a lot of the women did. They just kept, it wasn't just about thinking about the market or just thinking about the great work, you know, they were curious and they were going off in a lot of different directions.
Well, we'll have to, get our hands on the book and read more about it. But
thank you.
That's great. There are a lot of questions about your book coming up in the chat, so I think there's going to be plenty of people ordering it from Barnes and Noble tonight or wherever they can find it. But, thank you so much, Katherine, this was just amazing. We really enjoyed it. There's many, many thank yous coming in the chat too. And we just had a good time with this evening. So we really appreciate it.
It was fun. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.